Now, world leaders gathered for the third day of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Secretary General Guterres stressed the severity of climate change, warning that it threatens food and global security. Nathan King has the details from the United Nations.
Climate change doesn't just severely impact the world's weather, environment and the global economy, but also threatens global security, as the United Nations Security Council heard on Thursday.
Where coping capacities are limited and there is high dependence on shrinking natural resources and ecosystem services, such as water and fertile land, grievances and tensions can explode, complicating efforts to prevent conflict and to sustain peace.
The Council heard from Niger, whose representatives talked of battles over shrinking water supplies, which are fueling low-level conflicts and impeding development. Most countries recognise that climate change is having multiple adverse effects on human societies, but many Council members have been stressing that discussions and agreements on what to do about it should include most of the world. They said the UN Security Council should not have primacy over global climate policies because only 5 of the world's nations hold veto power on the Council. Non-permanent member India stressed that point, and China agreed, saying,
We must uphold the Convention and the Paris Agreement as the main channels and respect the right to speak on an equal footing by all countries on climate change issues. It would be inappropriate for the Security Council as a forum to replace the collective decision-making by the international community.
The UN Secretary-General also addressed the opening of the Food Systems Summit. Food supply chains are inequitable and often unhealthy, he told the gathering. While 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet, 2 billion of the world's population are overweight or obese. 1/3 of all food produced is either lost or wasted, and food production is a major driver of climate change.
We need food systems that support the health and well-being of all people. Malnutrition, hunger and famine are not forces of nature. They are the result of the actions or inactions of all of us. As a global community, we need to ramp up emergency food and nutrition systems in areas affected by conflict or climate emergencies. We need to invest in early warning famine prevention systems. And we need to shock-proof all of the systems that contribute to nutrition, from food systems themselves to health, water and sanitation. Nutritious and diverse diets are often too costly or inaccessible. And this can lead to poor consumer choices or no choice at all. I urge governments and businesses to work together to increase access to healthy diets, including by incentivizing new behaviors.
We also heard speeches Thursday from the leaders of the United Kingdom, Cuba and South Africa, all giving very different interpretations of the conflicts and challenges facing the world. But all three agreed on one thing. The top 2 challenges facing the world right now are COVID and climate change. Nathan King, CGTN, outside the United Nations in New York.
And another sharp focus during the UN General Assembly is the inequity of COVID-19 vaccine distribution. And leaders of many African countries took to the podium to speak out. Namibian President Hage Geingob called it vaccine apartheid. He said it was a pity that while people in some countries were at the stage of receiving booster jabs, people in other countries had yet to receive their first dose. Several African leaders, including South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, urged UN member states to support a proposal to temporarily waive certain intellectual property rights established by the World Trade Organization. And this would allow more countries, particularly low and middle-income countries, to produce COVID-19 vaccines. And since 1962, the U.S. government has maintained a trade embargo against Cuba, severely hampering the Caribbean nation's economic development. And more than 170 member states of the United Nations have supported a 1992 resolution for the Cuban embargo to be lifted. But this has been ignored by the U.S. At the UN General Assembly, Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel delivered a blistering attack against Washington, accusing it of abusing sanctions.
Under the leadership and with the ongoing incitement of the United States, we see a serious international rift being promoted with the harmful use and abuse of coercive economic measures. which has become a central instrument of U.S. foreign policy. They often use the term international community to define a small group of governments that accompanied Washington's will without question. It seems that for the rest of the other countries, the vast majority of members of this organization, there is no room for us in the definition of international community, which is advocated by the United States.
And on the third day of the general debates at the UN, world leaders have used their speeches to highlight their support for multilateralism, saying the UN is still the best forum for reaching a global consensus on important issues. Sarah Wharton reports in New York.
At the launch of the high-level week of the UN General Assembly, the Secretary-General warned a room full of delegates that disagreements were a threat to world peace.
Geopolitical divisions are undermining international cooperation and limiting the capacity of the Security Council to take the necessary decisions.
World leaders were listening, and over the week they've echoed his calls for cooperation.
Today I call on the international community to strengthen multilateralism in the area of health and to make progress in vaccine distribution equity.
This is Egypt's clarion call to all of humanity. Let us stand together to save ourselves before it's too late.
But the United Nations has become notorious for highlighting disagreements. This year, 3 Security Council resolutions have been vetoed and 5 have passed with abstentions. Analysts say doubts about the strength of multilateralism at the UN are nothing new.
In the 70s, people posed the same question. You know, when we had tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, and there were folks worrying about, is the world even holding together? We fast forward to today, what if we see? The more things change, the more they stay the same. There's nothing about the current era that poses a challenge. International cooperation is always difficult.
President Joe Biden's speech was seen as a return to a belief in multilateralism by the US following the presidency of Donald Trump. Biden underlined US efforts to form alliances around the world.
We elevated the Quad partnership among Australia, India, Japan, and the United States to take on challenges ranging from health security to climate to emerging technologies. We're engaging with regional institutions from ASEAN to the African Union to the Organization of American States to focus on people's urgent needs.
But in China's speech to the General Assembly, President Xi Jinping called for the UN, where 193 member states sit equally in the General Assembly, to be the main forum for multilateralism. And analysts agree it remains the world's best option for reaching a global consensus.
The question is, if not that, then what, right? The G20 is very, very good about some things. It's been a remarkable source for collective action in response to the global economic crisis, right? However, when we've tried to talk about other issues, it hasn't exactly delivered.
The Secretary-General went into this year's General Assembly calling for a strengthening of global governance to ensure a United Nations fit for a new era. World leaders have certainly been saying the right words. It remains to be seen whether they'll follow through with the right actions. Sarah Walton, CGTN, New York.
Now, to discuss this, let's bring in Ms. He Wenping from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She's a research fellow at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies. Ms. He, welcome to Global Watch. Well, first of all, as our latest report mentioned, world leaders are voicing their support for multilateralism at the UN General Assembly, which is the best place to address that, indeed. And it is a word we often hear when talking about international order. So first of all, Ms. He, help us understand how exactly multilateralism works under the UN framework and also the challenges.
Well, I think United Nations itself is the most important platform for safeguarding this multilateralism, because we start this UN mechanism. How can we hear different voices coming from different parts of the world? And simply now the world, all those issues has been dominated by just one or two or some very small those groups. For example, like G7 has used to be small this kind of mechanism for issuing a lot of things in terms of international issues. But actually later on, G20 comes up and make more those inclusiveness, because more countries from different continents has joined in that G20. But compare with all others like G7 or G20, but I think United Nations itself, of course, is the most important multilateralism, this platform. So every year, every September, all those leaders come to this assembly to make their voice heard. I think this shows this is the platform for all the people can have the voice heard. So I think at the moment we need to safeguard this, authority of the UN rather than to weaken this authority of UN. Of course, the most challenge for this platform, this UN multilateral platform, I think is coming from those hegemonicism and also those unilateralism. They just want to marginalize the UN and make themselves becoming the determined force in the international arena.
Well, that's true, isn't it? Because Donald Trump, the former U.S. president, actually was fiercely against multilateralism. But Biden is having a different attitude, it seems. He talked up multilateralism during the gathering. But on the other hand, we have to see that it's embracing smaller circles, such as the Quad Group and the AUKUS partnership just happened. Do you find these two attitudes contradictory with each other?
Oh yes, Biden administration has a different this kind of style compared with his predecessor, Trump. The Trump is very obvious, saying America is the first and make America greater again. And in Biden's words, he has been talking quite a lot about the multilateralism, saying even in this assembly speech, he said the U.S. has no intention to make any new Cold War. But in action, we have seen the United States has done a different, those kind of movement. Like you just mentioned, there's a Quad and also the AUKUS. Let's make a small circle with themselves, of course, as the core. And also we call it it's kind of like a club strategy. Just using several those key allies, and like Australia, like Japan, and like UK, of course, and also together with other allies in the Asian Pacific region. So those kind of action and totally not fit with his words. So their words are not matched with the deeds. So that's the paradox. I think those paradox means that the U.S. have to make their action should to fit their words. That's why otherwise all the international society cannot convinced by their just the beautiful those words has been talked in the UN Assembly.
Right, and we're also seeing African leaders coming on to the UN stage to call for a more equal COVID-19 vaccine distribution. So how can less developed countries make sure their voices are heard at the international institutions like the UN?
Oh yes, I think this UN Assembly itself is a very good platform for listening all those voices coming from a big power country or those small and weak country. Actually, so that's why I mentioned again, we have to safeguard this multilateral platform like UN, and then to bring those all the leaders come to the stage and make their voice heard. But that's not enough. We also need to make action. So all those international society have to work together and pour in more resources to help those least developed countries to fund their resources to combat with this COVID-19, like to secure those vaccine for saving more lives, and also to bring more resources for those countries to develop the economy, to do this recovery of the economy. As we all know, nowadays, the vaccine, equal vaccine distribution, I think is the fundamental challenge right now international society now is facing. As we know, 80% of those vaccines now has been just those, shared by those rich and developed country. But for those poor and the least developed country, they're short of those vaccines. So how come we are now living in a same global village? If one part of the world, they are still suffering from this pandemic, I don't see any hope for this global security coming from this shock of this COVID-19.
All right, thank you very much for your insight, Ms. He Wenping from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. We appreciate your time.